and welcome to Dialogue. Disputes in the South China Sea between China and the Philippines have been increasingly a serious cause for concern, with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang calling the relationship at a crossroads. What's noticeable is that frequent maritime confrontations took place following growing U.S. military presence in the Philippines. So what is at stake in the South China Sea? What has brought events to this stage? And how will Beijing and Manila go forward from here after a year of friction? Join us for our discussion today, live from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today are Professor Chen Hong, Executive Director of Asia Pacific Studies Center of East China Normal University, Professor Rosario Malindog-Uy, Director and Vice President for External Affairs of the Asian Century Philippines Strategic Studies Institute, and Warwick Powell, Adjunct Professor at the Queensland University of Technology and the Chairman of Smart Trade Networks. Welcome to Dialogue. And I will start with you. It was recently the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang warned about the situation, said any naval miscalculation could escalate problems in this region in the South China Sea, and called the relationship between Beijing and Manila at a crossroads. So what do you make of his comments? Where are we now? Are we somehow facing a tipping point after which a major, disruption could happen?
I actually agree with Foreign Minister Wang Yi, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, on his comments that a miscalculation in the South China Sea between the Philippines and China, especially when there would be a confrontation, a collision of ships, because of the escalating tension, is not good for the region, not just for the two countries. So it's very important for both countries to actually de-escalate tension, try to talk it out, whatever it is that they have differences in terms of maritime and territorial claims in the South China Sea, and try to calm down, because the situation right now is tension driven. And I think both sides are also driven as to their claims. So for me, the best possible forward is for both countries to have open communication and activate the consultation process as to the dispute in the South China Sea. And I really hope the Philippines would be more open and more open-minded and pragmatic in trying to to have to facilitate understanding with China, and try to calm down the situation in the South China Sea, because it's not good. Whatever happens in the South China Sea, may it be if it turns out to be a military confrontation between the two countries, it's not just the two countries that will suffer or will be affected. It's the whole region. It's actually the ASEAN region plus China who will be facing a lot of the consequences of this thing. So an open communication is very important, and I hope it starts soon.
Well, Professor Chen Hong, some Chinese scholar describe the situation as, we are at a point, or could be at a point of no return in terms of this bilateral relationship. Is the situation that serious?
Well, yesterday, China's foreign ministry spokesperson, Mao Ning, also appealed to the Philippines to rein back the wild horse on the dangerous course away from the cliff, so to speak. So I think, yes, we are now at the most critical time that could lead to conflicts, and the trajectory of the events is indeed treacherous. But as Mao Ning said, China's door of dialogue remains open. So I think China has demonstrated an unmistakable readiness to avoid more serious developments, and the Philippines need to respond to China's appeals proactively and constructively.
Warwick, during this year of friction, we do see, both sides releasing footages of ramming into like the boat, the ship, or sometimes also the usage of the water cannon, for example, accusations against each other. I mean, how would you comment on the efforts or how the two countries try to manage the situation in the year?
Look, I think it has gotten worse as the year has gone by, particularly in terms of the incidents at sea. Importantly, however, I think that the parties need to reflect upon the bigger picture and what is at stake. The fact of the matter is that the Philippines and China have been developing very strong economic cooperation over the years, so much so that only at the beginning of this year, a whole range of mutually beneficial agreements were entered into by the Philippines and China. And so it's important to keep disputations within a broader context as a pathway to bringing the temperature down and remembering what's at stake.
Speak of the business relationship, Anna, tell us more about that. For a lot of people, when they talk about China, the Philippine relationship, they often point to these disputes over some of the, islands there. But obviously, there's another side to the story. Even some business people or business community in the Philippines have expressed different opinions, basically disagreeing with the government's stance. They think that's a bit aggressive, and they think Philippines is too enthusiastic of the U.S. partner, in pushing forward this Indo-Pacific strategy against China here in the region. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, actually, if you really look at the Philippine-China relation, it's not, I mean, the dispute in the South China Sea is not the sum total of the Philippine-China relation or bilateral relation. It's just a very small part of it, it's a tiny part of it. When you talk about Philippine-China relation, there's a lot of areas to it. In terms of economic relation, I mean, China is our largest trading partner. It's a very important economic partner of the Philippines, and we benefit tangibly because of this economic partnership. And that's a big part of our bilateral relation. We have cultural relation with China, we have people-to-people relation, which is also vibrant. So the whole China Sea dispute is a very tiny part, and it's not the sum total of our relationship with China. However, the problem is, there is this external power in the Philippines right now that is heavily influencing the foreign policy of the current administration under President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. And that kind of pivot from a more friendly and independent foreign policy from the Duterte administration has to a certain extent have changed 365 degree or say 360 degree. So that's the problem right now. And of course, it's something that both countries should talk. It's something that both countries, I think, should work on. But on the other hand, it's also a big problem because you have an external power exerting, which is the United States, exerting so much influence when it comes to foreign policy. Precisely because of Indo-Pacific strategy that is operating right now or being operationalized by the United States in the Asia-Pacific region. And I think my country is being used as a pawn or a proxy by the United States. That's really the fact of the matter. But of course, Filipinos like us, we don't want to have problem with the China. China is like a close neighbor. We cannot change geography. So as much as possible, Filipinos and Chinese have to work it out together, and the dispute should be managed carefully, open-mindedly, and pragmatically speaking, because that's just a tiny part of our bilateral relation with China. And I really hope that the current administration of Ferdinand Marcos Jr. will be more open-minded, will be more pragmatic in looking at the dispute, and would have that independent foreign policy trajectory rather than a foreign policy that is more leaning towards the United States. Because at the end of the day, in the long run, it will not benefit the Philippines.
Warwick, earlier you also mentioned about the larger picture. Are you referring to this Indo-Pacific strategy from Washington or the U.S. competition, I mean, so-called competition? The efforts is to keep China down, of course, and you wonder whether there will be, a proxy conflict, if not a proxy war in this region.
Absolutely. There's no doubt that the United States foreign policy, particularly towards the Western Pacific or the Asian region, has experienced a ramping up of intensity in the last decade or so. The United States, going back the last 70 years, has largely seen the Pacific as its very own backyard. It used to describe it, and probably still does, as America's lake. It has utilised the geography of the island chains to implement a military containment strategy over the decades, and its sense of a loss of primacy within the region is one of the underlying factors that is causing greater instability, particularly as it seeks to reclaim primacy within the region. And frankly, an American foreign policy within the Asia region that is dominated by the objective of American primacy, is the antithesis of regional peace and what's required to establish and sustain regional peace. That's the first part. The second part of the big picture, of course, is how the region itself and its constituent member nations resolves the issues and creates the institutions that will allow the region to go forward on the basis of a consensus that works for the countries of the region in particular. I think they're the two dynamics at work here.
Professor Chen Hong, do you think the Chinese side, obviously, I think they have seen the U.S., they understand the U.S. strategy, they understand the relationship here, between Washington and Manila, and of course the disputes partly because of the U.S. growing presence there. So, by understanding that situation, do you think the Chinese side responds properly? Maybe that explains why I think you do see the excess of restraint from the Chinese side. They're using the water cannon instead of a more, let's say, a strong force against the Manila side.
Yeah, I think actually, as the Chinese spokesperson Wang Yang said, the Chinese side has been demonstrating the restraint and also professionalism. As you mentioned, actually, the water cannon. I watched actually the footages released by the Philippine side, and it is quite clear, plain to any eye, that actually the spray actually was actually over the vessels rather than at the hulk of the vessels. So in other words, it acts as a kind of like a warning rather than as a kind of a show of force or muscle. That is actually a indication of the Chinese side to be ready, to reach a kind of discussion or negotiation rather than to be colliding with the Philippine side, because the Chinese side knows very well that actually the Philippine side, as Anna was mentioning, was being used, being manipulated by the United States and trying to weaponize or instrumentalize the Philippines. So I think actually the Chinese side is ready to negotiate and discuss with the Philippine side. So I really think actually the ball is in the court of Manila.
Well, Anna, at the beginning of the administration, President Marcos Jr., if you recall, he appeared to be very supportive of a cooperation in terms of a relationship with China. For example, he said, quote, if we agree, we will cooperate and we will work together. And if we differ, let's talk some more until we develop a consensus. After all, that is the Filipino way. Now, if you look at the recent remarks by the president, he talked about a paradigm shift, meaning involving more countries to conduct military patrol or military drills in the South China Sea. Of course, that risks a larger confrontation with China. So why the change of attitude? What happened?
To be very frank with you, we also are thinking what's really the reason why there's suddenly a change of heart, as far as President Marcos Jr. is concerned. Because even during the campaign, I was part of a debate and I was one of the judges actually, and I was able to ask him directly about his foreign policy. And it's really all about cooperation with China, trying to solve the dispute in the South China Sea peacefully, amicably, and diplomatically speaking, and striking an independent foreign policy, and just following through with the Duterte administration foreign policy, the previous one. But as of now, it's completely a different story that we're seeing. There are so many speculations to that, but I think it's more also about the fact that probably he wants to project himself as a strong, as a strong leader that would assert our maritime and territorial claim in the South China Sea, and trying to back, probably trying to bank on or trying to depend on what you call support of the United States, or through the Mutual Defense Treaty, the EDCA, and the VFA, the Visiting Forces Agreement. So all of these right now are, all of these are speculations. But for us, as far as we are concerned as Filipinos, I mean, personally, I don't agree with the shift in foreign policy, and we're really urging our government, the current administration, to look at the situation in the South China Sea and look at in broad sense and long-term perspective, and not to rely too much on the promises of the United States, because the United States is good at promises, but it really does not really follow through with its promises. Until now, it always say like, our relationship is ironclad, but no action as to that. It's always about words. So I really hope that the current administration would be more will have more wisdom to see things and to put forward a more balanced foreign policy, and to resolve the dispute in the South China Sea amicably, peacefully, and diplomatically, and not just to think about the Philippines, but to think of the region as a whole. Because anything happens between China and the Philippines, the whole region, the ASEAN region, and even the wider Asia Pacific region will be affected. Everyone is, we live in an interconnected world. So it means it will not be good for the whole region as it is right now. Because the tension is escalating and heightening. So yeah, there's so many speculation as to the change of heart of Ferdinand Marcos Jr. But I cannot speculate that much because I have to have proof for that.
Yeah, yeah. Understandable. So Warwick, of course, we know that in April, the U.S. Secured 4 more military bases in the Philippines. And of course, the two sides expanded their military drills to include the joint exercise in and over the South China Sea this year. People, as we discussed, people see that as a direct factor leading to the increasing confrontation in the sea between the Chinese side and the Philippine side. But at the same time, people would wonder, the U.S. Has already enough trouble at hands, Ukraine war, and of course you have the Gaza conflict over there. They don't have the intention to have another war in Asia. How do you explain, how do you see this?
Look, I think first and foremost, this is fundamentally driven by a diminution of American primacy in the region and a reaction to that by the American foreign policy elite. This is, in a sense, a natural reaction of a nation whose policy elite have become accustomed to a position of entitled primacy, where a region of the world was largely subject to their broader hegemonic imprimatur. Now, the pattern that has been emerging within the Asia region, particularly in terms of the intensification of, let's just call it military pressure, if you will, through activities in the South China Sea and also in the airways, together with the additional military base presence decisions, looks remarkably similar to the kinds of things that were happening in Europe over the course of the last 10 years that ultimately led to the events that we have been witnessing in Ukraine over the last 2 years. And I think we need to be very mindful of that Asia itself does not inadvertently become another arena of a proxy war. Now, the other thing to bear in mind, and I guess this is the other dimension to this, as the other guests have mentioned, this is actually about a region. It's not just about two countries. And the disputations concerning these particular shoals actually aren't just bilateral disputations. There are many other countries who also hold claims to these areas. And these actions is not just about China, but it's actually raising questions for all the claimants about how they need to bring themselves to the table, not be used by others, and to resolve the issues in their own interests so that we achieve a stabilized, peaceful environment in the region for all concerned.
Mm-hmm. Chen Hong, of course, we understand that there's, to what extent do you see there's a danger of a proxy war, if not today, maybe a couple of years later, as the situation continue to escalate, with the support from external forces there getting involved and increasingly militarize this region. How big a danger do you see?
Well, obviously, unfortunately, as we were discussing, the Marcos administration has been acting as marionettes, with the strings pulled by the United States. But I seriously don't think the Marcos regime is ready to be on the course to be engaged in a proxy war with China. It is simply outrageous and out of mind. So just look back in history at the outrageous events of wars and conflicts. The anti-China forces in the United States are, of course, happy to see China to be embroiled into conflicts or even war. But is Marcos Jr., really prepared to pay the price for the interest for the hegemonic goals of the United States? So I'm basically an optimist, in nature. So I hope Marcos Jr. and his administration have the political wisdom, as we were saying, to place, the Philippines' national interests, long-term national interests, before the ulterior motives of the United States.
And how optimistic are you? What's the public opinion like in the Philippines? Do people say agree with the government? Somehow becoming very enthusiastic in the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. Not completely, let's say, for the sake of the Philippine national interest here.
As far as like the enlightened Filipinos are concerned, I don't think we don't. I mean, it's very obvious. Like as far as I'm concerned, and other Filipinos, I think we don't want to be a proxy. Our country to be a proxy in the strategic, in this strategic competition between China and the United States. That's one thing. And as far as we are concerned, as Filipinos, as a nation, we don't want to have any kind of military conflict and war with China. We are a small country. We're not even economically developed. We're not even at par with with China. And I think President Marcos Jr. knows that very well. And I think he knows that. I know that he knows. But the only thing here is like this, no? There are many politicians in my country that they have their interest tied up with the United States, and that's the danger to it. And that's the problem also with my country when you talk about politics, because sometimes politics muddled and compromises the national interest, the long-term national interest of the country. But as far as Filipino people are concerned, as much as possible, we want to resolve the dispute in the South China Sea peacefully, diplomatically, amicably between China and other claimant states. Because we have to remember the dispute in the South China Sea is not just between China and the Philippines. There are other claimant states as well that needs to be involved in trying to resolve the issue, because the conflict or the dispute is overlapping. So we need to factor them in. On the other hand, for me, as much as possible, and other Filipinos, we want to have good economic relation with China, good political relation with China, and try to have that open dialogue and negotiation with China, how to come up with a very good and amicable settlement of the dispute that would benefit both countries tangibly, and we will not end up in a military conflict or a war in the region, because it's not good for my country, it's not good for everyone. And I really hope, I really, really hope that my president, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., will see it clearly and will have the wisdom to make the right decision given the escalating tension in the South China Sea between China and the Philippines. Because at the end of the day, the United States is just meddling with this issue, and they don't have the right to meddle in this issue because they are not party to the dispute. They're not even signatory to an UNCLOS. So I hope the United States will refrain from meddling in the South China Sea dispute, because they don't have any business doing it.
Warwick, if you look at, as Anna mentioned, the claimants to this region, not only in China, the Philippines, you have other parties in the region, like Vietnam, like Malaysia, for example. But why it's so hard for Philippines to pursue a policy similar to that for Vietnam and other countries? People call that as independent foreign policy, trying to balance between Beijing and Washington for the sake of their national interests. Instead of serving the interests of others, probably.
Well, history, of course, leaves or casts a long shadow, and the Philippines has been an ally of the United States for a very long time, and in fact has been one of the longest Asian allies of the US within our region. So I guess history always plays a part in how nations shape their views about what their interests are, and how they balance their relationships with others. But what I will say is this: there are multiple claimants in the South China Sea. For many years, there has been numerous so-called land grabs, and there is a desperate need for the multilateral processes involving ASEAN and China to be worked on with diligence and with open and creative minds to arrive at a code of conduct that will enable all the parties who have a relationship to the South China Sea to understand and agree to arrive at a consensus on how this resource within our region is to be managed collectively. Everybody interacts with it. Everybody's economic welfare depends upon the appropriate management of this resource. And I think the time has come for multilateral institutions of ASEAN and China to really put their head down, to bring the leadership to the table and tackle this code of conduct challenge and really bring it to a finality.
Mm-hmm. Well, Chen Hong, of course, speak of resolving the disputes in the region. There's joint efforts from countries, between China and ASEAN countries for mapping out a code of conduct. And so, how do you describe the stance of the regional countries, for example, other ASEAN members? How concerned are they in terms of when they see the disputes between China and the Philippines here?
Yeah, as the two other discussions have been pointing out, there are other claimants in this region who also claim have claims to the atolls, islands, and shoals. But actually, through this kind of mutual respect and also based upon the negotiation discussions, we're able to actually to reach a status in which actually we're able to maintain stability and also the peace in this region. This is very important because actually China has been clear in its stance to carry out candid and also constructive bilateral and multilateral dialogues with those countries. For peace and stability and also prosperity in the South China Sea is very important, so that transport, exploration, development, fishery activities are to be carried out in a mutually agreed terms. What's more, we're saying about the code of conduct. That is actually the most important, way that actually for all the agreements, all the countries to be, engaged in a way that can be constructive. So I think actually, the recent provocative adventure by Manila is in fact detrimental to its own security and also long-term national interests, as we were saying.
Mm-hmm. Well, with the conversation with the call, phone call made by the two foreign ministers, from China and the Philippines. So if you listen to their, dialogue, their conversation, are you confident that they will engage more in dialogue rather than say clashes, confrontation in the sea? Chen Hong, yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think actually, China is ready, to work with the Philippines to properly handle, the maritime issues, through negotiations, through consultations, and we really hope that the Philippines would stop pursuing, the course of, confrontation and return to dialogues. This is the sensible and practical way that both China and the Philippines should take at a critical time, and that is really what we should be getting ourselves prepared for the next year, for the new year.
Yeah, for the two countries and the entire
My
region.
side, I'm coming from the Philippines.
Right.
Yeah,
Sorry, we have to stop there. And with that, we come to the end of today's discussion. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. Thank you for being with us. I'm Xu Qinduo. See you next time.